Science diplomacy has been around for centuries and millennia, the sharing of knowledge from the East to the West. At the time, we didn't call it science diplomacy. We just called it sharing of inventions, knowledge sharing. You'll see is science diplomacy is using scientific collaboration, knowledge sharing, and evidence-based decision making to advance international and global challenges. Science in diplomacy, using science in foreign policy discussions. Diplomacy for science is discussions leading to cooperation or to potential collaboration down the line. The U.S. Global Change Research Program is uh, it's an interagency. It is a bipartisan act, and its main goal is to promote global change research. Is the idea of linking the natural sciences with the social sciences and thinking about how humans play a role in these realms and affecting the Earth system that we live in. Neuroscience is actually, and surprisingly, a field where it does bridge social and natural sciences. I think what makes the US very special is the US, I think one of its main exports is knowledge. US universities are a huge strength. The US research ecosystem is a huge strength. Being on that same page and working towards a shared common goal, like I think that is what drives and strengthens relationships.
Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Science Talk. This podcast, as you know, explore the intersection of science and diplomacy through the lens of environmental neuroscience and global collaboration. The guest shares his insight from the work he has done over the past several years across academia, government, and international partnerships. We'll be highlighting how science can build trust, address climate and health challenges we are facing today. And also, it will be a little bit talk on the global international relations and how science play an important role in it. The conversation also offer advice for maybe early career scientists who are interested in science diplomacy and discuss emerging areas with transformative potential. Dr. Brian is an environmental neuroscientist with more than 15 years of experience in leading and building large transdisciplinary teams across academia, industry, and government to promote overall science, climate, education, and medical diplomacy. Dr. Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mohammed. It's a pleasure being here, and I'm really excited to chat with all of you on your podcast about what is science diplomacy. I also dove into this space without realizing what is science diplomacy, and it's a real pleasure to share with you all the where we are at in science
Yeah,
diplomacy.
thank you so much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you, Brian. So let's start our conversation with the fundamental question for the audience. What is science diplomacy?
Science diplomacy is actually a new term that started back in 2009. I think we officially coined it. But in fact, science diplomacy has been around for centuries and millennia. So, for example, if you think of the Silk Road, that is a form of science diplomacy, the sharing of knowledge from the East to the West. And at the time, we didn't call it science diplomacy. We just called it sharing of inventions, knowledge sharing. But today, science diplomacy has a very interesting and new meaning. Um, and if you look online, the classic definition you'll see is science diplomacy is using scientific collaboration, knowledge sharing, and evidence-based decision making to advance international and global challenges. So that's a very broad definition. What does it mean? If I dive into it a little deeper, there's a more, how do I say this, concrete definition that I think is more concrete. It's the AAAS, so the Association, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Royal Society have another definition, which is broken up into three parts. Science diplomacy is the use of science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science for diplomacy. And so the way that we break that down is thinking about science in diplomacy, using science in foreign policy discussions. Diplomacy for science is discussions leading to cooperation or to potential collaboration down the line. And then science for diplomacy looks at how do we build scientific collaborations to improve international relations? This could be the International Space Station. This could also be the Antarctic, for example. And so that's how I define science diplomacy. Of course, there are challenges, there's a lot of opportunities, but that's how like we conceptualize the conversation definition of science diplomacy.
Awesome. That is super helpful. So you have worked at various industries in academia, government relations. So one of the U.S. Department or the program, which is called United States Global Change Research Program, which do a little bit work on this side. So what do they do, and how do they advance science diplomacy?
So U.S. Global Change Research Program is uh, it's an interagency uh, organization that is founded or was founded back in 1990 by an act called the Global Change Research Act. It is a bipartisan act, and its main goal is to promote global change research and coordinate the resources across the agencies, and not just thinking about the local scale for US, but also global. Hence the name US Global Change Research Program. And the idea of global change, is for those who are not familiar with it, is the idea of linking the natural sciences with the social sciences and thinking about how humans play a role in these realms and affecting the Earth system that we live in. Of course, the definition that we can think of is climate change, but it's also thinking about how health plays a role in climate change, how economics plays a role in climate change, supply chain, national security, the conversation goes on. But because this is global, the US Global Change Research Program does work and collaborates with international partners and governments internationally to support the research ecosystem that is not just in the United States, but abroad. So that's in short what the US Global Change Research Program is.
Programmers. So, thank you. So, you, as I said, you have worked at various institutions before, and you have a PhD in environmental neuroscience. So, your overall experience and your contribution to overall in advancing international science diplomacy, how do you see that role you have been playing over the past 15 years?
So I think if I move back, what is my role and what was it like and how would I get to where I am is how I'm phrasing this question, right? And so I think as a neuroscientist coming in, environmental neuroscientist coming in to the field of global change and science diplomacy sounds like a huge jump, but
Yeah.
I'm going to walk back and explain how it isn't really, because I think it sounds pretty logical. For one, neuroscience is actually and surprisingly a field where it does bridge social and natural sciences. So if you think about psychology and sociology, that's one realm. And then we got the medical and biological sciences of neuroscience, of how the brain works. That is, that I would say, the natural side. The way that we think about neuroscience, or the way that thought about neuroscience, is thinking about how does genetics, how does biology influence the way that we think, learn, and remember. That very much is the linkage between natural to social. And environmental neuroscience takes that a little bit of a leap further to think, how does the environment, our built environment, play a role into shaping our biology, our health, and how that our health impacts the way we think, remember, and interact in the world. So, for example, this could even be childhood development. There's critical periods where a toddler learns from its environment and who it's around, what skills it gains. That's environmental neuroscience. We can also think of air pollution and health and how air pollution disproportionately affects certain communities more, leading to more diseases. That also is environmental neuroscience. And in a sense, that translates really well into the theory of global change, because again, global change is the way climate change and humans interact and the system that we're in, making it interdisciplinary, not just interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, where it bridges multiple topics and themes together into one. And thinking about what system-based approaches and thoughts and topics interact with one another. So that's how I got to where
Yeah,
I am.
yeah, no, that's I mean that's where the social determinants of health comes in. A lot
Mhm.
of that, and that's hardcore sociology of health. If you think about that, or population health, or even anthropology comes into to play. So, in your experience, so for example, U.S. Spend a lot of dollars on R&D and research and collaboration and international relations. So, in your view, for example, what is unique about the U.S. Science diplomacy? Because I know, like, I've been attending a couple of events in D.C. where a lot of European embassies and consulates have science counselors, science diplomats who are trying to bridge a gap between Europe and North America and between researchers, universities. So, in your experience, what is unique about the US science diplomacy, which is different than other countries, and what are its strengths?
I think what makes the U.S. very special is the U.S. I think one of its main exports is knowledge. And I think U.S. universities are a huge strength. The U.S. research ecosystem is a huge strength. The U.S. has a huge startup culture and industry. And I think that major strength is there's a lot of players at play. Let's put it that example. And I think a lot of people turn to the U.S. For advice, for help. And again, back to my definition of science diplomacy, knowledge sharing. It's I think that's one of the main aspects of the what makes US so special. But on the other hand, other countries are just as special too, because they also have knowledge that the US doesn't have. For example, if we think about what happens in low and middle income countries, they may not have the tools and resources US might, other upper income countries might. And some of the skills and the ways that lower middle income countries navigate their world is, I think, really valuable to the United States. Thinking about there are better alternative solutions. Another way you can think about it is better nature-based solutions that we can apply in the US by learning from the ways that low and middle income countries handle issues. And I think this is one of the strengths that we have this openness of scientific collaboration, not just here, but abroad with our partners.
So, as you know, when it comes to science, the trust is very important, right? And the trust is a very tricky variable or very tricky thing to build, and it can shatter within no time, right? So, among scientific collaborations, how do you think the countries, when they collaborate with each other, or do more, strong science diplomacy that can actually contribute to building trust among people on science? Because scientists have been trying their best to increase trust in science, but there are cases when they've been successful and there are cases when they have not been successful, and it's very complex, complicated issue. But when countries do their business together and do bilateral relations based on science, do you think that does enhance or contribute to building trust in science?
Well, so yeah, yes. To a certain degree, and yes. I think one of the key languages I would say in science diplomacy, or actually maybe backtrack and say it a different way. I think one of the ways that multiple countries can share the same common language. I don't mean English. I don't
Yeah.
mean like an atypical UN language. What I mean is language of science, whether it's mathematics, common ideas, theories, knowledge. I think being on that same page and working towards a shared common goal, like I think that is what drives and strengthens relationships, regardless of failure of a research project or an idea that didn't end up in fruition. I think that in itself, being able to have those open conversations, identifying a shared goal, working towards it, builds that trust. We see this with a lot of previous examples of international collaborations. One example that I think of that comes top of mind is CERN. The CERN is based in Geneva. It is a nuclear particle research facility, and that was built after World War II, where there was a lot of distrust among European nations. Like, how do we build that trust again? CERN came out of that. Um, and I think that's a really good example of how, even though there are tensions,
Mhm.
science can be the way to unite a shared common language. And what's amazing about it is CERN is no longer just EU. CERN is international.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Because as at the end of the day, mostly countries do face similar climate, health, and other challenges, regardless how to what extent they're impacted. But everybody is impacted and influenced, and their societies are impacted by these changes. So let's go a little bit into your own area of expertise, which you came from. You had a PhD in environmental neuroscience from University of Southern California, right? If I'm not wrong. So how do you see that discipline, particularly neuroscience or environmental neuroscience, play in advancing science diplomacy goals, particularly climate change, when it is becoming a global security concern because the water level, sea level is rising, and heat waves and all of that. At the midst of this, it does become a security issue for certain countries more than others.
Yeah, I think for one thing I was just mention that's really important is that countries are the ones that drive science diplomacy, and their national interests drive science diplomacy. For me, I'm just a cog in the wheel, if I could put it that way for a metaphor. Might be a little loose, but I'm part of that movement. I don't drive that gear, let's put it that way. Countries do. And so that's one important fact that I want to mention about my experience in the science diplomacy sphere. Um, but one, I would say, issue that I think is top of mind that leads to a lot of climate change, global security concerns is the idea of geoengineering. And I think, and I think this is a really nice parallel, an example for why it's so important. So I'll go with the topic of geoengineering in a second, but I link it and think it back to my own experience in neuroscience, where I have a background in biology. I understand genetics. I understand genetic modification. There is a very famous technique called CRISPR. I can't think of the exact acronym at the moment, but this technique is used to cut and paste DNA and makes genetic engineering very, very easy. There was a researcher back in 2019 that decided to genetically modify humans, two twins, and this is a CRISPR experiment. This led to a ton of ethical considerations. And the reason behind that is thinking about it from the lens of the human, like why and how does this allowed?
Yeah.
One, and did the kids, or did these twins as they grew up, have the consent before they were born? And at least in this ethical dilemma of like, whose fault is it anyways? And did they give consent? And the same idea comes into this major climate change global security issue, which I said geoengineering earlier, is very similar to this. So geoengineering, in short, it's the way of changing where you can modify weather patterns and climate and there's two forms. There's a natural and then there's an unnatural form. For those people who are not familiar. So the natural would be like volcanic eruptions, and the unnatural is thinking about marine cloud brightening, for example. And there's many different ones out there, but I'm using that one as an example. And what does that mean? It means one way of doing it is throwing sea salt or some type of salt into the clouds. That makes the clouds brighter in a sense. It reflects light and goes back out into space, therefore cooling the earth a little bit. What happens afterwards is that it can change weather patterns. And then the question becomes, whose responsibility is it anyway? If you make one cloud region brighter and you don't, and then that leads to a drought in one place and a flood in another place, another country, whose fault? And that same idea, that same ethical dilemma is what I carry along from my past experience from neuroscience into geoengineering, thinking about those ethical situations. Another way that neuroscience comes into play, I'm going to use the same example again, because I think it's kind of interesting into thinking about this
Yeah.
butterfly effect in a sense, is if one form of natural geoengineering is iron clouds
Mhm.
that are from the Sahara Desert in Africa, where we can all, it's also known as the Saharan dust.
Mhm.
So NASA did a huge, the National Aeronautics Space Administration, they did a report on this, seeing these clouds blow up, these iron clouds blow up into the North Atlantic Ocean. From there, you see the precipitation of these iron dust particles fall into the ocean. The Atlantic current moves it to warmer waters, such as the Gulf of Mexico. And from there, what we see is when that happens, we see large algal blooms in that area. And you're thinking algal blooms, okay, you have more life, you have more growth. But actually, algal blooms are pretty damaging for the environments, for the ecosystem. Because one, algae suck up all the nutrients in the area. Um, and two, they also produce toxins.
Mhm.
And you're thinking, okay, they produce toxins, they take a lot of nutrients. What's the big deal? It's great. It provides more nutrients back into into the water and all that, and more for the environment. But what's interesting is if you think about it this way, I think of algal blooms like beer, the way that you make beer, right? Like there's a lot of nutrients. This is great. The yeast are growing and thriving, but then eventually they kill themselves.
Right.
So a lot of things in that area will die because of algal blooms, right? The toxins that the algae releases, those other creatures that live in the bottom of the ocean, for example, we have clams and mollusks, they take up those toxins. And who eats them? Who eats those raw shellfish? We do. Other animals do. And what are those toxins? Those toxins are, for example, neurotoxins, right? That's something that I think about too. Red tide, if that sounds familiar to anyone who lives on the coast, that's also a form of an algal bloom. So this is a long way of saying, right, that there are certain actions, such as if it's an iron cloud dust storm that goes into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, um, leads to toxins in our food. There is a chain. It's like a butterfly effect, right? But the question becomes, is like, what causes this chain reaction from the beginning? How did we get dust clouds? Why is the Saharan desert so dry? Are there ways to prevent this? How could science diplomacy play a role in this whole transition from algae, backtracking all the way to dust clouds? How could science diplomacy play a role? There are humanitarian organizations that work on how do we build and improve agriculture in and around the Saharan desert region. So that when we do that, we prevent that dust cloud, that topsoil from blowing up. And we keep it down and we keep those nutrients on the ground. That's a form of science. That's one way of thinking about how do we utilize science diplomacy to prevent these catastrophic natural situations.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the fascinating things, and I think amazing things about science diplomacy that it tackles global challenges because it does affect all of us in one way or the other. If something happening in Africa and it's gonna happen here, or like it's gonna affect people here, because the world is very interconnected. So now let's move into a little another area which you have expertise is medical diplomacy, and I'm from originally from Pakistan, and a lot of Pakistan and India has a lot of tension going on right now. But there is a very active medical diplomacy between those two countries because a lot of people who do not find a cure or a treatment for certain diseases go to India to get that treatment and vice versa. So that's way people it's a people to people connection, and the humanitarian aid and hospitals are like medical systems are involved. So I asked you about the science diplomacy definition. Now I'm asking you, what is medical diplomacy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the way that I'm going to phrase medical diplomacy is more along the lines of public health diplomacy. And I think that is more resonant of what medical diplomacy is because because public health is more broad. It
Yes.
includes people. Involves communities and needs and societal drivers compared to medical diplomacy. Um, and and I'm assuming what are some examples where how I define it and the way that I've been involved in public health diplomacy. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. And so some of the ways that I've played a role is, again, at US Global Change Research Program, is working with agencies such as NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They have a program called HEAT. They have a program called NIHIS, the National Institute for Heat, I think it is, or heat.gov. And one of this particular program, what it does is it helps inform communities about the impacts of heat waves on human health and their environment. So what that means is if you think of a heat wave, what happens to your body? You start to sweat, you get uncomfortable, changes your mood and behavior, right? The environments, the place that you live in, and if you live in a city, you have urban heat islands. Certain areas get hotter than others. In a city, where you have a lot of urban heat islands, where are those places normally? There are places that don't have a lot of greenery. There are places that have a lot of concrete that are not well ventilated. Those are certain communities that are more marginalized and more lower socioeconomic regions. That's something, in a sense, what NOAA tries to work on, for example, is how do you work with the communities and develop that knowledge sharing platform. There are a lot of organizations out there that also participate in this. There's GIN, and there's also WHO and WMO that plays a role. But one of this particular program that plays a role in this public health diplomacy is the building of, or the designation of someone called a chief heat officer. And this particular person, what they do is they rally and build a coalition of the willing in communities. So, for example, one of these piloted communities is in Sierra Leone. They have a chief heat officer that rallies people and try to build awareness for what is heat? How do you cool down in a heat wave? And help tell people what are the certain types of people who are more disadvantaged or are more impacted by a heat wave. Those with renal disorders, for example, are more impacted by a heat wave compared to others. Um, and what to do? What can you do? Right? And they share this information with other cities, such as Santiago and Rio. They're also planning on building out their own network of community members to inform our citizens about how to stay hydrated, how to stay cool in the heat wave. These are public health issues that we talk about sometimes in the US, but sharing that information about ways to do this, that's science diplomacy.
Yeah.
It is a soft power, but
Mhm.
it's power nonetheless.
Yeah, absolutely. I know because a lot of people, countries, where the air pollution is very bad and they do not have a system to detect the air quality or to monitor air quality, or they cannot afford, and then the US and the European countries or other countries would go and kind of maybe install on their one of their embassies so that would monitor air pollution for that city. So that is also part of the work
Mm.
they do normally. Uh, so, as you know, we just transitioned out of COVID recently, and a lot of talks were on how which country is exporting or which country is giving more vaccines to which country. China was giving, all of Africa, US companies were giving, aid or helping other countries to get vaccinated. So, how do you see after COVID, this medical diplomacy field is changing, or when it comes to with global health equity or vaccine diplomacy?
It's a really good question. I think one of the ways that I think about this, what came out of the COVID era, is thinking about which countries, which community, which people need more aid than others. And is there a way we can systemically think about this issue? I'm going to cite something that we made, our US Global Change Research Program put out a couple years ago. It's called the National Climate Assessment. And
Yes.
it's the fifth edition. And those who are in the climate sphere, those who are very familiar with it because it is something that's mandated by law to produce every certain number of years as an update of what happens in the US. And this information is mostly for policymakers and decision makers, but also for community members too, to understand what is the risk
Yeah.
of X in their community, and can they and should they prepare for it?
Yeah.
And so, one of the things that was in this national climate assessment is in chapter 20, the social systems and justice chapter. And I think this chapter really highlights some of the things that came out of the COVID era, and especially thinking about environmental justice.
Mhm.
There are three realms of environmental justice, and it's kind of links to your conversation earlier, but I hint where we talked about earlier about social determinants of health. But the three dimensions of environmental justice are recognitional, distributional, and procedural.
Mhm.
So this is getting at recognition is why does it matter?
Yeah,
Um, um,
this is
like
good.
policies that reflect the value of the people, the cultures and perspective of affected peoples. Then there's distributional, like who gets what and how much. For example, like waste facilities are more found in more predominantly poor communities. And then procedural, like who decides and
Hmm.
so environmental impacts that need people and participation from the communities, and how do you engage them in these conversations from the beginning and not at the end? And that's kind of the intersection that the three of those, procedural, distributional, and recognitional, those touch on our define environmental justice in a sense. And I think with those 3 points and pillars in mind, if we carry that out into the public health diplomacy realm, we start to thinking about how do we help, how do we address these systemic issues? What are the ways we can include more marginalized communities and members to be champions to talk about these issues so that we do develop a system that is in place that is more equitable, that is more fair, so we don't have these challenges in the future like we had during the COVID era.
That makes sense. So thank you for the explanation. So my one of the questions I always, because we look at what is right now and that tells us how it's gonna go in the future. So for example, the two questions, but I will just couple them together. So one is, what would you say to somebody who's looking at their career in science diplomacy, coming from the STEM field? What advice or what would you say to them? What kind of skill set do they need? And also, what do you see the future of medical and science diplomacy in bilateral relations in the future?
Sure. That's a loaded question. I'll see if I can combine the two together. But I'll first start with the students. For me, I stumbled into this because I loved science policy. Like I wanted to get into that field. But little did I know that my interest in international collaborations led to science diplomacy, right? So one of the things I want to highlight is that as a scientist, if you're a graduate student, if you're an undergrad wanting to go and get a PhD, or if you're interested in the sciences, but you want to put it in towards policy, I would say that if you're a scientist, you're curious. You're always going to want and then willing to learn and teach yourself many things. Like, don't forget that. Like, policy is complicated. Policy is multiple layers, interweaving. Um, and be interested, stay curious. The second thing I will say is like if you're working in a lab, for example, and you're always, let's say, I don't want to use the word stuck in a lab, but if you do a lot of wet biology research or wet research where you're making buffers or stuff like that, like there that and if let's say for example, there's always someone in the lab that doesn't make a really good buffer, and you know that will impact your experiment. Um, you know that yourself, that you will create your own buffer, right? And I'm using this example, and you're trying to, where am I getting to, Brian? Like, why, right? Like, well, this is a transferable skill. You making your own buffer and knowing that there's a bad buffer in the lab is risk mitigation. You're constantly thinking about this. And what I'm trying to say is that as a lab technician, as someone who's worked in a lab, you have this transferable skill. You understand the concept of risk mitigation. So think about those transferable skills. The next thing I will say is science communication. Like always think about how do you, or try really hard to think about different ways to communicate science to a different, more broad audience and tailor and shape it to different people based on their needs. It is a skill. It is difficult to learn. And for me, myself, I did this through science advocacy. Where did I get this and how did I get this? There are a lot of organizations out there that have opportunities for you to go to your legislative branch, which is going and advocating for these issues to let's say, for example, Capitol Hill, if you're in the US. In the US, there's organizations that have these with specific terms as early career science policy ambassadors or Capitol Hill Day. These are the terms that you would find, or fellowships that the term that you would find for a lot of scientific organizations and take part in them. And this is how you learn to craft your story and narrative to policymakers. And the last thing I would say is really look into building your network, build those soft skills of conversation. Yes, it is difficult. So small talk is difficult. I understand if you're as a scientist, you'd like to be introverted and stay in the
Yeah.
lab all the time, but soft skills are needed because it's a people, international relations. It's in the word relations. So you need to build relationships with people. And the ways you can think about this is I'm going to highlight an idea is thinking about look towards fellowships. There is a triple AS, Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. If you're in the Americas, there is another one called IAI, Inter-American Institute. They have one called Science and Technology Policy Fellowships as well. And there's a if you're in Europe, there's also other ones. There's other ones too, like the Marie Curie Foundation. They have a policy fellowship there as well. So there are many of them out there because science policy is the way I think about it is boundary spanners between policy and to the scientific experts. And they need people to be that in between to convey that communication. And those fellowships give you that opportunity. And so, what are the challenges in the future that are important to think about? Well, a lot of these fellowships will be thinking about the emerging issues, especially when it comes to fellowships, right? What I mean by that is what recently AAAS put out a fellowship for AI, an AI special cohort of SCP of the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. This cohort wanted people to think about AI and the uses of AI and how to be able and communicate AI to a broad audience in policy, in those who develop policy. And so I think one of the major emerging areas in the field of science and or medical and health diplomacy, public health diplomacy is AI. It sounds very much of like a general answer,
Yeah, yeah,
but
but it is true. It is true. Yeah.
yeah, it is. It's very, we don't know where it's going to go. Um, and I think there are ethical concerns.
Mhm.
There are security concerns related to AI, especially when it comes to health. Um, so being open to that and explore that. If you want to find out more about these fellowships, you can always follow me or find me on the internet.
Yeah,
I usually
I
repost.
will put those links in the description and in the video so they can check those fellowships. And I'm familiar with those, but for the audience, thank you for sharing those pieces of advice for early career or students who are working in lab in the STEM field and looking their career in science policy or in the government or in relationship building or in the science advocacy field. So thank you so much, Brian. Appreciate your time so much. I think this conversation was amazing to see how the science and medical diplomacy can or does or can offer or can achieve in the global challenges we are facing right now today. So thank you so much for your time. Appreciate that.